Well, the last unit for grade 10 Bible is also the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. The world of Revelation is towards the end of the first century, so somewhere between 80 and 100 AD, a long time after Jesus had come and gone. This was the world dominated by the Romans. By this time, the city of Jerusalem had been destroyed, the temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed, and the Jews had been scattered all over the Roman Empire. It was known as the diaspora, and they would never return to the land for nearly 2,000 years. So this was a difficult world. The Christian church had moved out of Palestine. It went from being a Jewish church to now becoming a global church. Lots of Greeks, lots of Romans, lots of people from other tribes. It had spread from India to probably Scotland and all the way south to Ethiopia and the Sudan. Several things were happening at this point. The Jewish system, not necessarily individual Jewish members, but the Jewish system by this period had rejected Christianity. They had turned their backs on Jesus and the teachings of the church. We also saw the rise of Roman persecution. The Romans began to see Christianity as a threat to its life, threat to its existence as an empire. And so persecutions broke out around 64, 65 AD. And these persecutions would carry on for about 300 years before the situation would change. By this last period, ideas in the church were kind of proliferating. New ideas were coming in, new concepts that are not related to the teachings of Jesus, ideas like who Jesus really is. Is he really God or is he really human? What is the church really? Is it a physical building or is it a spiritual organization or is it simply just a concept? What faith means, what life and death means. Is there really a resurrection? Are people really going to go to heaven or to hell? By this stage, the writer of Revelation, John, he was the last of the disciples of Jesus. In fact, probably the last of that first generation of Christians. He would experience an exile during one of those persecutions by an emperor called Domitian and ended up in this little island off the coast of Turkey and known as Patmos. And it is there in Patmos that he received the visions which became the book of Revelation. The book tells us about Christ and the future history of the world, all the way to the recreation and the new creation of God. When we are studying Revelation, the Greek name is Apocalypsis, or Apocalypse, the unveiling. It's important to recognize what we are dealing with. We're dealing with a type of writing, a literary genre known as apocalyptic prophecy or apocalyptic literature. This kind of literature focuses very much on the end of the world. It has the idea that this world is going to get so bad that God has to destroy it and recreate. Now, apocalyptic writings was not unique to the Jews or to the Christians. It existed among the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, and various other forms. Now, the biblical apocalypse, the book of Revelation, is usually misunderstood because people don't take into account something very important, that the book is filled with what we call opaque symbols, where imagery rather than reality is the primary form of writing. So there are numbers, but the numbers have a meaning. There are colors, the colors have a meaning. There are creatures, but the creatures have a meaning. And so the big struggle in dealing with Revelation is having to decipher all of this. So when Revelation speaks about a beast that comes out of the sea, we're not talking about an animal that comes out of the sea. This is not like the movies, No, it's talking about something else. That's just a symbol. And it's not an easy symbol to penetrate. Or the beast that has 10 horns and 10 heads or whatever. It doesn't mean that there's an animal somewhere with 10 horns, but rather that everything in these symbols stands for an idea, a concept, or an event that takes place. And so we have to come to terms with the kind of writing, the literary genre, apocalyptic literature, or else we will misinterpret Revelation. So have some fun with the book of Revelation. We know the author of Revelation is John, who was one of the first disciples of Jesus. And so let's try and understand his life a little bit. And the best way to understand John's life is to see John in a geographical context. When we first meet John, he lived in Galilee, and for most of the time that he was with Jesus, he was a Galilean. First a fisherman, then a disciple of Jesus. Galilee was the center of his life. As a disciple, as an apostle of the church after Jesus left, most of his early years were spent in Jerusalem. He and Peter worked mostly in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. So John's life for a number of years was concentrated in Jerusalem. Eventually, John migrated up into southern Turkey to a big city known as Ephesus. And he would spend most of the rest of his life, probably from around the age of 40 or 50 until he died, close to 90-something, in Ephesus. Ephesus became the center of John's life. But during his stay in Ephesus, he was also put as a prisoner and exiled in this little island of Patmos. He was there for a number of years. And in Patmos is where he wrote the book or had the visions. And probably when he was released, came back to Ephesus, looked after the church, that's when he began writing down the materials that he had in vision. What is special about John is that he had this unique relationship with Jesus. He was the very first disciple to follow Jesus. He was the only one who was present at the trials and the crucifixion of Jesus and one of the first to see Jesus alive. He identifies himself in his writings as the disciple whom Jesus loved. He understood the love of God better than any other writer of the Bible. He was closest to the heart of Jesus. In the great painting by Leonardo da Vinci, we see John sitting next to Jesus on the right side of Christ at the Last Supper. We don't know if that was actually true. What we do know is he was always there. And when Jesus was about to die on the cross, he asked John to take care of his mother, Mary. Apparently Joseph was dead, and Jesus did not have a good relationship with the brothers who refused to accept him at that point. And so he entrusted Mary into John's hands. He became the caretaker for Mary until the day that she passed away. So he had this very special relationship with Jesus. And the first one to really understand that Jesus was not just human, he was God on foot. That is what Revelation is all about. God walking through history. We need to have a bird's eye view or a macro view of Revelation. Despite the difficulty of the symbols, despite the difficulty of the prophecies, the book is actually simple. It says that there are two powers in the book. Think of it like two towers. Think of the Twin Towers in Malaysia, for example. These are two systems, and they are in conflict. One system, let's say this white tower, is God's system. And so many of the prophecies in the book are talking about God's system, his government, the people in that system and how it works. Opposed to that, represented by this green block, is the system known as the counterfeit. And everything that God and his system tries to do, the counterfeit and its system tries to do. So you have a head here, you have a head here, you have other powers here, you have other powers here. You have citizens here, you have citizens here. And these two systems are in conflict with each other. And according to Revelation, it is that conflict that eventually brings the end of the world and the recreation. The other part of this big eye view of Revelation is that the counterfeit is always trying to challenge God. It is like a rebellion against God. It is like a usurper. It is trying to overthrow the government of God. And yet, in the book, we see what actions God is taking against this counterfeit. Every prophecy of judgment that you see in the book is God's system, God and his government, God and his kingdom, fighting and trying to overcome the work of the counterfeit. Towards the end of the book, we see that God eventually defeats the counterfeit and it is eliminated from the universe, and then only one system will remain, God's world. And that becomes the new creation, a new heaven and a new earth. That is Revelation. If you understand that, you understand the message of Revelation. It's not just a bunch of prophecies and symbols, but rather it's a picture of how God is in conflict with the counterfeit called Satan and his government, and eventually the victory of God and his people. So I hope you are a member of God's system, because that is the guarantee of new creation, new universe. In lesson 5, we look in more detail at these two systems. When you're dealing with the government of God, you learn about God, about Jesus, about the Holy Spirit. You have a picture of a woman who represents God's people, and then you have pictures and symbols of the different groups of God's people. There's a group called the 24 elders, there's a group called the 144,000, there's a group described as the great multitude. These are all part of the system or the tower belonging to God. In the counterfeit, we have exact replicas. So God is counterfeited by Satan. Jesus and the Holy Spirit are counterfeited by beast creatures, one that comes from the sea, one that comes from the land. There is a woman here who represents the people of God. There is a woman here who represents the people of the counterfeit kingdom. You have groups of God's people here. You have groups of Satan's people over here as well. And this is an important part of understanding Revelation, because you can't just read from chapter to chapter. You have to actually isolate the materials. What materials belong to this system? What materials belong to this system? And then you can see everything God does, every piece of his puzzle is counterfeited here. To use language from social media, this is real news, this is fake news. This is the one that leads to the new creation. This is the one that leads to the lake of fire and eternal extinction. But here's the thing. The peoples of the world inevitably will choose sides. There are many who will be part of the system of God. There are many who will be part of the system of the counterfeit. These will be burnt later on in an event called the lake of fire. These would inherit a brand new creation, an eternal and perfect world. And so this provides us with a challenge. Are you going to be part of this or part of this? And you can choose. You may be misled or fooled or become gullible to the counterfeit and all of its components. Or you can keep your eyes on God and Jesus and understand and learn all of the components in this system and become a part of it. I hope that you will make the right choice as you study the book. The judgment scenes in the book of Revelation tend to follow the number 7. So you have the 7 churches where judgment is threatened against God's people if they're not faithful. You have the 7 seals where judgment begins to fall on the world and on the system of Satan. You have the 7 trumpets where the judgment accelerates. And then you have the 7 plagues which are considered to be the top of the numbers of 7. But there's also the final judgment that occurs at the lake of fire, and that leads to the final creation of a new earth. Now you may wonder, why 7? Throughout the Bible, the number 7 is seen as the perfect number of God's activity. And so in Genesis, we have 7 days in the creation story. 6 days of actual work added with a 7th a day of rest, a Shabbat. And so throughout the Bible, especially in apocalyptic writings, the number 7 plays an important part in telling us what God is doing. And this is especially true in the writings of John. So in the Gospel of John, we read of the 7 signs or miracles of Jesus, the 7 statements or sayings of Jesus where he uses the expression, I am something or the other. And here in Revelation, you have many sets of 7s dealing with the judgment acts of God. 7 is seen as a perfect number. We don't know why. The Egyptians had 5 as their perfect number. In Revelation, the counterfeit system has 6 as its perfect number. But the perfect number of God is 7, not just in Revelation, but also in John and other parts of the Bible as well. And so when you're reading about the judgments of God, they come in 7s. But think of it like this. God doesn't just tolerate the counterfeit. He is doing something that eventually will destroy the counterfeit and bring it down. See, these are the judgment acts of God. And the fact that there are so many of them tells us that God is very active to ensure the survival of his people through eternity. The last vision in the book of Revelation is about a new creation. John says, I saw a new heavens and a new earth. He also sees this very special city called the New Jerusalem. And he tells us that in this new creation, there will be no crying, there will be no tears, there will be no death, there will be no bad things, no illness, no old age. And he uses the expression, the old things will be gone. Everything will be new. A new kind of time as well, called eternity, where God's people will not die or even be subject to death anymore, where they will live forever. And the conditions of life are also described. The kinds of people who will be there are also described. We are also told that there will be a new relationship with God, that God will no longer be living somewhere out in some celestial place up in the universe, but that God will come and live on this planet, recreated planet, along with his people. He will make his home among his people. You know, Christians often think that we will go to heaven. This is not in the Bible. In the Bible, we will go to heaven for vacation. In fact, Revelation tells us that the vacation will last for 1,000 years or so. But we will come back here, and God will also come back, and everybody will live on this planet. This planet will become the center of the universe. Imagine that. Right now, we are in the corner of the universe. We are this tiny little speck, and we wonder if there's anyone else in the universe besides us. So many people think we are home alone in the universe. In Revelation, we are told that this little speck called Earth will become the center of the universe. And God will reorganize in this new creation the entire cosmos around Earth, and he himself will be there. I think the most exciting part of this new creation is the choice that you and I can make. Because you see, if you choose God's system, God's kingdom, then you will be in this new creation. But if you choose the other system, the other kingdom, then you will not be there. You will not have a chance. And so I'm going to place this question before you. There is this promise, beautiful, grand, exciting promise about a new creation. Do you want to be a part of it or not? If you do, then I hope that you will give your life, your heart, your mind to Jesus so that he can prepare and keep you safe for that moment. All right, we've come down to our very last lesson. And this has to do with the book of Revelation and Hollywood. By Hollywood, I mean, the whole world of entertainment and movies. This may come as a surprise to you that in the 20th and particularly the 21st century, Hollywood has used a great deal of materials from the book of Revelation. The word apocalypse, the word revelation, the four horsemen, ideas about the end of the world, ideas about judgment and cataclysms, ideas about how this world will not last and eventually it will be destroyed, and even ideas about the divine appearing in these things. You will see this in so many different types of movies and television series and documentaries arising in the entertainment business, that the world is not going to last. The world will be extinguished. Something else will happen. There will be an after earth. There will be, all kinds of things. Many of the ideas and the images and the motifs of these movies and television series are driven by ideas and concepts, motifs and imageries from the book of Revelation, including the name of the book itself. And so there is this very unusual, very unique relationship between Hollywood and the Bible. The world is interested in the end of life. And so they have found some inspiration in this very last book of the Bible. So many people are learning things about Revelation from the movies, from the films, from the television series, and they don't even realize it actually comes, or the original ideas come from the Bible, from the book of Revelation. So next time you watch a movie that seems to be dealing with something about the end of the world, don't be surprised if you can find a parallel in a Revelation. And when you do that, I hope you will appreciate the depth of God's Word and its contribution to your life.